I'm going to be talking today about roughly actually the same topics as Guido was talking about 2 days ago, but in more or less the diametrically opposed direction, that's to say. Pretty much point for point we disagree on these issues. So anyway, but there's a certain amount of common ground at least over which we're fighting. So what I'm going to present is at least in the first instance, a kind of interpretation of some ideas of Herder's, and it actually comes from a book on Herder I've just finished. And the general context is that the philosophy of language of Herder. Herder is extremely important for the philosophy of language. And in particular, he established two principles that are really the foundations of the discipline as it's existed since. And the first one of those is that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language. In other words, you can only think if you have a language, and you can only think what you can express linguistically. You don't necessarily have to express it linguistically, but you have to have the ability to do so, the competence to do so. And the second principle is in a similar spirit, that meanings or concepts don't consist in the kinds of things that much of the philosophical tradition had thought they consisted in, such as Platonic forms or subjective mental ideas in the manner of Locke or Hume or Condillac, or the things themselves in the manner of the Augustinian picture of meaning, that the meaning of the word cow is cows or a cow. But instead in word usages, in ways of using words, roughly speaking. And so these are the two principles that I'm interested in here. And Herder actually develops very sophisticated positive arguments for these principles. He doesn't just affirm them as dogmas, but develops quite sophisticated arguments. Just to mention part of the case, I'm not going to go into the difficult parts of it, but part of the case actually finds a link between those two principles. So Herder ends up arguing, in at least his best line of argument on this subject, that the fact that meanings or concepts consist in word usages actually grounds the principle that thought is dependent upon and bounded by language. Why? Well, because thoughts of their very nature are constituted by concepts, articulated in terms of concepts. And so if concepts are by their very nature word usages, one can see that it follows automatically from that one needs to have a language and one in order to think, and one is going to only be able to express what or think what one could express linguistically in words. So that's part of the case, but I'm not going to sketch the whole positive case. What I am going to do is talk about his equally careful and thoughtful attempt to fend off some potential objections to this theory. And he actually identifies at least 5, I would say, major areas of seeming counterexamples to these principles, and then tries to diffuse each of the counterexamples. And over the course of his career, the general trajectory of his development here is that he'll initially develop a solution, a way of diffusing the counterexample that isn't very plausible, really, doesn't really quite work. And then he fine-tunes it or finds an alternative, rethinks it, and eventually comes up with really quite a sophisticated and subtle way of diffusing it. So I'm only going to be talking about one case here. There are actually a whole bunch of cases. The deaf and dumb is one example. They seem to be a counterexample. They seem to be able to use thought and entertain concepts without using language. Some animals seem to be able to do this as well. The case I'm going to be talking about, though, is art, because this is the one that's relevant for the conference. So more specifically, non-linguistic art, things like painting and sculpture and instrumental music. So, because a further set of challenges to those two principles, of course, comes from this area, right? It looks on the face of it as though painting, music, sculpture sometimes expresses thoughts, concepts, meanings, without employing or presupposing language in order to do so. And so it looks like a counterexample, right, to these principles. So that's the role in which I want to consider these cases. This question that I'm going to be addressing is intimately related to another one. The two principles in the philosophy of language I just mentioned effect a sharp break with the common Enlightenment assumption that thought and meaning are prior to and autonomous of whatever material perceptible expressions they may happen to receive. So much of the Enlightenment had thought dualistically in terms of the relation between thought and language or expressive media more generally. And Herder is clearly against that. He's rejecting that. But there are different ways in which you might reject that, different specific ways. So the general move to thinking that actually you do need a material, perceptible medium in order to do any thinking or conceptualizing, that general move has been called by Charles Taylor in a different connection, expressivism. I mean, that's a word that's already been kind of used for other purposes, but I'll take over that word because Taylor suggested it for this move. And this break with the Enlightenment dualism in question is a very, very plausible one, I think. But the question remains left over, what form expressivism should take exactly? Because there are different versions of it you might propose. Is the dependence of thought and meaning on external symbols really one on language and words in the usual sense of those terms? Or is it not rather a dependence on a broader range of symbolic media that includes, besides language and words in the usual sense, also such things as painting, sculpture, and music, so that a person might be able to entertain thoughts and meanings that he or she could not express in language and words, but only in some other symbolic medium, one of these other symbolic media. So let's call the former position, the former option, the one that just focuses on language, narrowly so understood. Let's call that narrow expressivism. And let's call the other option, the broader option, broad expressivism, just so we have easy terms to refer to those positions with. Now, Herder's position is narrow expressivism. So he thinks that you can only think if you have, language in the strict sense. You can only think what you can express linguistically in the strict sense. You can't rely on other expressive media like painting or whatnot to do this underpinning job, as it were. Other people around the same time opted for the other option, the other variant. Some of the romantics, actually, Tieck and Wackenroder, seem to go in that direction. They include music. Hamann certainly does in his metacritique. He includes things like drawing or music as well as language as possible media. Hegel is, in his aesthetics lectures, not perhaps earlier on, but in his aesthetics lectures, a good example of this position too. He thinks that, for example, the Pharaonic Egyptians and the ancient Greeks were able to express things by their architecture, by their sculpture that could not yet be expressed linguistically. So they were already able to entertain thoughts, meanings that they couldn't express linguistically, but they could through another material perceptible medium. In this case, architecture and sculpture. So the main question that I want to consider here is just how defensible this position of Herder's is, especially in competition with this very attractive-seeming competitor, broad expressivism. So that's really kind of the issue I want to go into. What I want to argue is basically this. Herder began his career with a naive form of narrow expressivism that was quite implausible on reflection. But thanks to several years of struggle with the subject, he eventually attained a refined version of it that is much more, indeed extremely plausible. So my hope is that by going through this development and making some comments about it, we may learn something not only exegetically about Herder, but also actually something that will be philosophically illuminating. But that's a hope. Let's see. The key work in this connection is his Critical Forests from 1769, most of which was published at the time, but the last part, which is actually very important for certain purposes, not so important perhaps for ours, but the last part was only published in the middle of the 19th century posthumously. As we've seen, or as we haven't seen, actually, as my introductory remarks suggested, by this time Herder was already committed to those two principles in the philosophy of language. And as you might suppose, given that starting point, from the beginning in the Critical Forest, he's committed to narrow expressivism. So he thinks you can only think if you have a language, you can only think what you can express linguistically in the usual sense of language, and so forth. However, his commitment to narrow expressivism there is initially both naive and unsatisfactory, specifically in relation to the potentially problematic question of what one should say about non-linguistic arts, painting, sculpture, music, and so on. For one thing, his way of saving his narrow expressivist principles that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning consists in word usage in the face of the phenomenon of such arts, is to deny the non-linguistic arts any capacity to express thoughts or meanings autonomously of language, by denying that they can express thoughts or meanings at all. Right? So that's the extreme and perhaps in the end rather naive version in which he tries to champion this narrow expressivism. Thus he initially sets out in the work to argue that whereas words and poetry have a sense, a soul, a force, he uses all those terms, by contrast music is a mere succession of objects in time, and sculpture and painting are merely spatial. That whereas poetry not only depends on the senses, but also relates to the imagination, by contrast, music, sculpture, and painting belong solely to the senses, namely to hearing, feeling, and vision, respectively. And that whereas poetry uses voluntary, conventional signs, by contrast, music, sculpture, and painting employ only natural ones. So this is the initial gambit. You say, well, these arts don't constitute a counterexample to my principles in the philosophy of language because they don't express meanings or thoughts at all. They're just sensuous in nature. And that's not very satisfactory in the end. It doesn't take a whole lot of reflection to see that's going to have problems. For another reason why there's a problem here with this initial answer is that Herder exacerbates that unsatisfactoriness into outright inconsistency, because from the start in the work he also has a set of intuitions that are sharply at odds with this sort of narrow expressivism, and even perhaps with narrow expressivism in general, intuitions that imply far more plausibly that non-linguistic art can express thoughts and meanings after all, and which even imply in a broad expressivist spirit that it can do so in ways that are neither achieved nor achievable by language. For example, in the first part of the Critical Forest, he intervenes in a quarrel that had arisen between Lessing and Winckelmann about whether, as Lessing thought, linguistic art is expressively superior, or as Winckelmann thought, visual art, especially sculpture, is so, in ways that tend to support Winckelmann's case for visual art, not Lessing's case. In particular, Herder argues against Lessing and for Winckelmann that sculpture can express not only the temporally transitory but also the eternal, that painting is capable of representing not only objects but also actions, that the visual aspects of a work of dramatic poetry, such as Sophocles' Philoctetes, are as important to its meaning as its linguistic aspects, and moreover, that all genuine poetry is, I quote, a sort of painting, so that, for example, even in its linguistic aspects, the Philoctetes is, again a quote, a series of acting poetic paintings. This unsatisfactory and indeed inconsistent position at the beginning of the Critical Forests resulted mainly from a single oversight on Herder's part. There's just one thing he hadn't seen, and that led to all these problems. His oversight lay in failing to see any way of reconciling two strong and both very plausible intuitions that he had, and which stand in tension, but not in fact contradiction with each other. On the one hand, his intuition that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning consists in word usage. And on the other hand, an intuition that non-linguistic arts do nevertheless express meanings and thoughts. As a consequence of not seeing how these could be reconciled, when in the grip of the former intuition, he felt compelled to deny the latter one, and when in the grip of the latter intuition, he treated this as tantamount to abandoning the former one. What he had not yet realized was that it's perfectly possible to maintain both intuitions consistently with each other. Namely, the solution's a very simple one once you see it, by insisting that the thoughts and meanings expressed by non-linguistic art must be derived from and bounded by the artist's capacity for linguistic expression. So, in other words, there's an implicit reliance on language, even in non-linguistic art. If that's the version in which you ascribe thoughts and meanings to non-linguistic art, there's no inconsistency with this philosophy of language. However, by the time Herder wrote the later parts of the Critical Forest, he'd discovered this solution. Thus, in the third part of the work, there are 4 parts in the work, in the third part, focusing on a particularly clear and instructive example, that's to say an example that illustrates with unusual clarity both that non-linguistic art does sometimes express thoughts and meanings, and that the thoughts and meanings in question have a prior linguistic articulation or articulability, he notes that the pictorial representations on Greek coins are typically allegorical in nature. And by the time he writes the 4th part of the work, he's prepared to say the same thing about much painting as well. He now writes, for example, of, quote, the sense, the allegory, the story or history, Geschichte, that is put into the whole of a painting. By 1778, at the latest, he extends this account to sculpture as well. Thus, in the text plastic or sculpture of 1778, he abandons the merely sensualistic conception of sculpture that had predominated in the earlier work, and instead insists that sculpture is essentially expressive of and therefore needs to be interpreted by a soul. But this no longer forces him into unfaithfulness to his 2 principles, that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning is word usage, because he now holds that the thoughts and meanings expressed by sculpture have a linguistic source. I quote, "The sculptor stands in the dark of night and gropes towards the forms of the gods. The stories of the poets are before and in him." Similarly, concerning music, Herder in the early 1780s moves away from the merely sensualistic conception of music that had predominated in the Critical Forest towards a conception that allows music intellectual content, but he does so in a way that's consistent with his principles, that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning consists in word usage, because he ties the content in question to a prior linguistic understanding. Whereas in a work from 1778, he's still only prepared to say that music is a dark expression of feelings. By the time he writes the Theological Letters of 1781, he praises the power of the instrumental side of contemporary church music to express ideas as well, describing it with Luther in a way that's significant both because it implies the music's expression of thoughts and meanings, and because it implies that this intellectual content is derived from a prior linguistic source as a, quote, second theology, that's to say second only to actual theology, and giving specific examples of how the instrumental aspects of a work such as Handel's Messiah expressed Christian ideas whose expression was originally linguistic. Quote a little passage on that. "What a great work this Messiah is, a true Christian epic in sounds. when you right from the start discern the gentle voice of consolation, and hear mountain and valley even out in the whole of nature at the arrival of the Messiah, until the exaltedness of the Lord reveals itself and the whole world beholds him together. Likewise, in the Letters for the Advancement of Humanity from the 1790s, Herders goes on to argue that modern instrumental music more broadly, as it existed in his time, of course, with its special emphasis on harmony and melody, developed out of Christian hymns, which were by contrast partly verbal and less harmonic melodic, and that by means of its harmony and melody it succeeds in expressing a certain quasi-Spinozistic idea of the whole, including a harmonious whole of all peoples, that it took over from those hymns. The details of the story don't matter too much, but the generic idea is that meanings and thoughts are being expressed by the music, which originally had a linguistic source. There is also an additional way in which Herder's considered position, at which he more or less arrives by the end of the Critical Forest, implies that non-linguistic art involves thought and meaning, and hence language as well. The above points have been concerned with the fact that, like linguistic arts such as poetry, non-linguistic ones such as painting, sculpture, and instrumental music are heavily involved in the expression of thoughts and meanings. But by the time Herder writes the fourth part of the Critical Forest, he also recognizes that thoughts and meanings, and hence language, are involved in non-linguistic arts in an even more basic way, namely as presuppositions of the very perception of such art by the artist or his audience. For in the fourth part of the work, he begins to argue, anticipating much 20th century work on perception generally, for example, work by Norwood Hanson and Thomas Kuhn, and also on the perception of non-linguistic art in particular, for example, work by Panofsky and Gombrich, that human perception generally and human perception of non-linguistic art in particular is of its nature laden with concepts, beliefs, and theory, and hence implicitly dependent on language. Consequently, on Herder's considered view, non-linguistic art is in fact doubly dependent on thought and meaning, and hence language, not only for the thoughts and meanings that it expresses, but also for those that it presupposes in perception. In sum, the considered position at which Herder arrives eventually is a refined form of narrow expressivism. It insists that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning consists in word usage, in the usual senses of the terms language and word. But it also allows that the non-linguistic arts have a power both to presuppose and to express thoughts and meanings. And it reconciles these two seemingly incompatible stances by holding that this power is one that the non-linguistic artist, or perhaps one should really now use scare quotes there and say non-linguistic artist, in fact enjoys in virtue of and in a manner bounded by his linguistic capacity. This position has important implications for Herder's philosophy of language. In particular, it shows, if it's right, that the narrow expressivism of his two principles in the philosophy of language can be plausibly reconciled with a forceful intuition that threatens to conflict with it, namely the intuition that much non-linguistic art expresses thoughts and meanings. It also carries important implications for Herder's philosophy of art and his theory of interpretation. And indeed, these implications would, in the 20th century, become, I would say, one of the main foundations for the development of art history in the form in which we know it today with people like Panofsky and Gombrich. In particular, it implies that non-linguistic artworks, painting, sculpture, instrumental music, and so on, are in important respects both similar to and dependent on language, and that the interpretation of them is therefore in important respects both similar to and dependent on the interpretation of language. It's a non-obvious and extremely important insight, I think. Now, with Herder's achievement of this position and Haman's achievement of his, there were now two incompatible and both somewhat plausible-looking answers available to the question of exactly what form expressivism should take. The refined form of narrow expressivism at which Herder had eventually arrived, that's what I've just been describing, and on the other hand, a broad expressivism in Hammond's manner, which says you do indeed need a material perceptible medium for thought and for conceptualization, but it doesn't have to be language. It could be other expressive media, perhaps music or perhaps sculpture, what have you. The 19th and 20th century German philosophical tradition, in particular Hegel, Schleiermacher, Dilthey, and Gadamer, henceforth tended to vacillate horribly between these two alternatives, not only between the thinkers, but even within one of these thinkers, sometimes even at a particular time in the person's career. However, I'd suggest that this vacillation is much less a symptom of the tradition's ineptitude, which is what you might infer, than of the genuine difficulty of the philosophical choice between these two positions. I think it's an extremely difficult philosophical decision or issue, which of these positions one ought to adopt. So the next question I want to consider is, which is the correct position here? And here I'm going to be continuing to talk about Herder, but you're going to be hearing a bit of me as well. To backtrack a little for a moment, one thing that can, I think, be said with some confidence in this area is that the naive form of narrow expressivism with which Herder started out, the form of it that denies that non-linguistic arts express thoughts or meanings at all, is untenable. That's not a position that's going to fly. As we saw, Herder himself comes upon a casus crucis, a crucial case that shows this clearly enough, namely Greek coins. Anybody who is familiar with the owl series of drachmas in Athens, for example, and knows the significance of the owl and so forth, is not going to be impressed by the claim that there's no thought going on there, no meaning involved. And Herder goes on to identify several further compelling examples as well, such as Greek sculpture. But the point can also be made by means of countless additional examples. For instance, ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian wall friezes that depict the events of specific wars and battles. There's no language there. It's just a drawing of people beating up on other people. But of course, it conveys a thought. We beat so-and-so on such and such an occasion in this battle. More recent equivalents, such as the Bayeux tapestry, for example, about the Battle of Hastings. Medieval and early modern religious paintings based on episodes from the Bible, including things like Rembrandt's paintings from the Old Testament episodes. So-called program music, such as that composed by Liszt and Smetana. For instance, Smetana's cycle of symphonic poems, Ma Vlast, with its expressions of thoughts about rather specific features of Czech geography and history, and so on. The list is almost endless. To deny that non-linguistic art expresses thoughts or meanings at all would pretty clearly be absurd on reflection when you think about such cases. Indeed, in many cases, for instance, the ancient wall friezes I just mentioned from ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, that is arguably the primary function of such art. It's an informational function above all. No doubt has further functions for glorifying the pharaoh who defeated the opposition or whatnot, but clearly the informational component is front and center. It's absolutely crucial. If anyone is even for a moment tempted to suppose otherwise, then that's probably only because he or she has been handicapped by a parochial focus on such things as 20th century abstract painting, for example, Jackson Pollock, and instrumental music, Arnold Schoenberg, for example. Right? If you focus in just these very local forms of art, and you don't know much about the rest of art history, you might find this view that there is never an expression of thoughts or meanings in non-linguistic art plausible. But the moment you go beyond, your little neck of the woods, you're going to be forced to that realization. In order to be at all plausible, therefore, narrow expressivism must instead take the more refined form that Herder eventually gave it. But is refined narrow expressivism correct, or broad expressivism? That seems to me a much more difficult question, and a much more interesting question, therefore. What I want to suggest, albeit tentatively, is that refined narrow expressivism is more or less the correct position here, but that there are two important grains of truth in broad expressivism, one of which Herder himself perceives, but the other of which he doesn't. So that's roughly the picture. It's a somewhat nuanced answer that I want to suggest, but not too nuanced. In order to support the first half of this verdict, the claim that refined narrow expressivism is more or less the correct position, let me say some things in support of Herder's refined narrow expressivist way of explaining instrumental music in particular. Since instrumental music seems an unusually favorable case for broad expressivism, and since most of the points I'm going to make could be extended to other non-linguistic arts as well, this specific focus may serve as a means to support a more general moral. So the hope is that if you can make out a case for the refined narrow expressivist answer to the question what one should say about instrumental music, then that's a long stretch towards answering the question for these non-linguistic arts more generally. Instrumental music does seem to me to be an unusually potent source of a temptation to broad expressivism. For in contemplating this form of art, we surely do often get a powerful sense that thoughts and meanings are being expressed, which it's beyond the capacity of language, existing language, perhaps even any language, to capture. At least I often get that sense. Accordingly, theories of this art form that attribute to it some sort of ineffable thought and meaning abound. No shortage of such theories. Here are two examples, and I've chosen them for their variety. They're not exactly the same sort of theory about this, but they are species of this genus. First of all, the later Dilthey, in his essay Musical Understanding, treats instrumental music as a prime case of broad expressivism, arguing that while such music does often merely express linguistic thoughts, in its higher forms it also expresses non-linguistic ones, in particular ones about the nature of what he calls life itself. So there's some sort of, he probably would reject terms like metaphysical or religious, but quasi-metaphysical, quasi-religious thought about life that is expressed by instrumental music in its highest forms. Though he does also say that often the thoughts that are expressed by instrumental music are linguistically based. So these are only, as it were, the higher forms of thought in instrumental music. Secondly, the musicologist Eduard Hanslick argues that music expresses strictly musical ideas. And following this lead, Stephen Bungay has argued more recently that it's just obvious that non-linguistic musical ideas and thinking occur. So that's a different species of this genus of view. Despite the admitted seductiveness of the broad expressivist intuition about instrumental music, my strong suspicion is that Herder is in the end correct to judge that this art form should be explained in a narrow expressivist way. So in a sense, all you need is language. So let me make a few points in support of such a view, and similar points, as I'll underscore at the end, would apply to painting and perhaps also to other non-linguistic arts. So this is exemplary rather than the full case. The intuition that instrumental music conveys thoughts and meanings which it is beyond the power of language, existing language, or perhaps even any language, to express, can indeed seem very compelling. And I don't want to suggest that it should be dismissed lightly. I really do think this is a very difficult issue. It's actually rather nice to come across genuinely difficult issues that aren't really clearly resolved yet in philosophy. Nonetheless, it seems to me probable that it's an illusion. And it may be salutary in this connection to recall the presumable illusion to which we often fall victim when we wake up from a dream, that we've entertained thoughts and meanings in the dream that are linguistically inexpressible. I don't know about you, but I quite often have had that experience. You know, I wake up thinking I've had some sort of intangible, inexpressible thoughts, and then I try to reflect on them, and they just kind of evaporate. They just sort of run between my fingers, and I end up thinking, well, you know, it was a kind of illusion, right? It was an illusion of thought or meaning. And of course, the relevance of that is that, you know, if you're at all inclined to think that we're not susceptible to illusions in this area of thought and meaning, then that example ought to dissuade you from that assumption. Right? So consider, first of all, Dilthey's attempt to vindicate the intuition in question, the intuition that we sometimes, through music, convey thoughts and meanings that are not linguistically capturable. Dilthey believes that instrumental music in its higher forms expresses some sort of, as I say, quasi-metaphysical, quasi-religious thought about life, as he calls it. This is a common enough conviction. Moreover, it may very well be correct. But why should one take the thought in question to be linguistically inexpressible, rather than, as Herder implies, linguistically expressible, and perhaps, moreover, actually derived from linguistically expressed metaphysics or religion? Certainly, the sort of thought that Dilthey has in mind here may be only quite vaguely expressible in language, but is there really any reason to suppose that the music expresses it any less vaguely? In other words, they may still be in step with each other, the language or the linguistic competence and the thought expressed by the music. Bungay's attempt to vindicate the intuition in question is different. His claim is not that instrumental music expresses metaphysical or religious thoughts that transcend language, but rather that it expresses distinctively musical thoughts and ideas that do so. This claim strikes me as somewhat more plausible, but in the end, questionable as well. It seems important to me to distinguish between two sorts of cases here. First, there are cases in which the relevant person, say a composer, possesses a linguistic or notational means of expressing the putative musical thoughts or ideas in question. In that case, it does seem to me appropriate to speak of his having or her having musical thoughts and ideas. But then these are cases in which he or she can express them linguistically, even musical notation being plausibly considered a part of language. Second, though, there are certainly also cases in which a person develops putatively musical thoughts or ideas without having any corresponding linguistic or notational means for expressing them. Think, for example, of the once fairly common phenomenon, having lived for over 30 years in Chicago, I'm thinking of the jazz scene and the blues scene, of course. Think, for example, of the once fairly common phenomenon of the skilled jazz or blues musician who cannot read music and is verbally inarticulate to boot. Right? You had extraordinarily skilled musicians around playing jazz and blues who couldn't have written a word of music and actually wouldn't have given you a very good verbal description either, right? So this is another type of case one has to think about. However, is it really so clear that in such cases we should speak quite literally of the person's having musical thoughts and ideas, rather than, say, of his or her creating and perceiving complex sound patterns and relationships? In other words, we have a competitor description, a competing description of what's going on in such cases that doesn't invoke literal thought, literal meanings or concepts, what have you. To my linguistic idea, at least, characterizing what they're doing in terms of thoughts and ideas quite literally, without qualification, would seem out of place in such a case. No doubt perfectly all right if one only was using these terms of thought and meaning metaphorically. There's a kind of metaphorical use going on, no problem. But it doesn't sound quite right to me to describe these as thoughts or meanings in the everyday sense of those terms. And incidentally, I'm not resting very much on this linguistic intuition of mine, because cumulatively one has to take into account all of these other philosophical arguments that are urging you in a certain direction, and it's really going to be the accumulation of considerations that is decisive here. It's enough for my purposes if our intuitions are just a bit torn about this. In short, it seems to me that non-linguistic musical thoughts and ideas may well once again turn out to be just a will-o'-the-wisp and a kind of illusion. However, turning now from something like refutation to something more like diagnosis, I suspect that there are also deeper sources feeding the delusive temptation to suppose that instrumental music expresses linguistically inexpressible thoughts and meanings. And Herder, I think, is again helpful in this connection. Herder often argues, very plausibly, that instrumental music is relatively inarticulate in the expression of thoughts and meanings. That's to say, relatively as compared to language. For example, there's one passage where he puts this in very, very strong terms, actually uncharacteristically strong terms. I'll risk quoting it, even though it is an overstatement. He says at one point that music gives the soul no determinate thought at all. Rather, as long as it is wordless, it leaves the soul free to retrieve what it likes from the treasure of memory. That's not his standard view, that's an overstatement of it. But clearly you can see the tendency to think that even if music can express thoughts, it doesn't do it as well as language does. It's not as articulate as language is. But Herder also often implies, again very plausibly, that instrumental music is relatively articulate in the expression of nuances of feeling or emotion. Again, relatively as compared to language. So it's better in that regard. It's better at expressing feelings or emotions, not as good at expressing thoughts or meanings. For example, Herder writes that, I quote, "Suffering and joy, all of inner feeling in its breadth and depth, can only express itself harmonically, must sound forth melodically." In holding that instrumental music can express something about feeling or emotion that cannot be as accurately expressed by language alone, Herder is in agreement with a long tradition that includes both composers and philosophers. For example, the composer Felix Mendelssohn says in one place that musical feeling is indescribable because it's too precise for words. And the philosopher Susanne Lange, who's quoted yesterday, develops a similar view in several works at some length. Beethoven implies similar things about the expression of emotions in his music. However, the suggestion that instrumental music expresses feeling or emotion and that it conveys nuances thereof more precisely than language alone can do requires some defense and qualification. We can't just sort of accept it without further reflection, because it's by no means always conceded that instrumental music expresses feeling or emotion at all, let alone that it does so more precisely than language. For example, the respected musicologist Eduard Hanslick denies this. And as we heard the other days, I think Guido is inclined to deny it as well. Perhaps the most serious objection to such a view is one that was first raised by Hanslick himself, and you didn't hear the other day, namely that feelings and emotions of their very nature incorporate intentional objects which seem beyond the reach of musical expression. For example, if you love or you hate, you can't just love or hate in a vacuum. You have to have an intentional object of your love or hate. You have to love this person, love that community, hate this person, hate that community, or whatever, or this state of affairs, or what. You need an intentional object. However, Roger Scruton, who has written a very interesting book on the philosophy of music. I must say, I hate to speak well of Roger Scruton because politically he's such an obnoxious character, but his book on music theory is actually, philosophy of music is actually rather good, so I'm not going to be speaking ill of him today as I normally would. So Roger Scruton, in answer to this sort of position, has provided a perceptive two-part response to this sort of Hanslick objection that we can take over and build on here. First of all, Scruton points out that instrumental music often does, in fact, express intentional objects. For example, church music expresses the thought of God. Right? People who know about the ancient dithyramb will know that it expressed the thought of Dionysus in particular, one god very, very specifically. Right? Second, Scruton argues that despite the fact that emotions do essentially include intentional objects, it is in an important sense possible to identify emotions without pinning down their intentional objects. That if, for example, one encounters an unknown woman sitting on a park bench weeping, one may be able, by observing her behavior, the wringing of the hands, the tears, and all the rest of it, one may be able, by observing her behavior, to identify the character of her emotion without knowing the intentional object that's involved. For example, whether she's weeping over the death of a parent, the thanklessness of a child, abandonment by a husband, or whatnot. There's a sense in which you can identify the character of the emotion in abstraction, as it were, from the intentional object, though it has to have an intentional object. I'd add, thirdly, this is my addition to Scruton's line of thought, that in such cases, it may also, in a certain sense, be possible to identify the emotion from observation of the person's behavior more precisely than could be achieved from a mere verbal description. That the person's complex behavior in its context, the woman on the park bench in the context and so on, may convey to one the quality of the emotion with a precision that could not be matched by a mere verbal description, either of the behavior and context or of the emotion itself, indeed. It's a certain kind of nuance of grasp of what that emotion's like that you can achieve by the observation that is sort of, in a way, beyond language. Though only in a certain sense, of course, because, of course, in another sense, namely that of pinning down the intentional object involved, the identification is, by hypothesis, less precise. Right? So it's important to distinguish these two, as it were, parts, is the wrong way to put it, but these two aspects of emotions in this context. This situation suggests that, similarly, nuances of emotion may, in a certain sense, be more precisely expressible by instrumental music than by language alone, even though in another sense, namely that concerned with the identification of the intentional object, they can usually only be expressed less precisely. Now, what I want to suggest is that the temptation to suppose that instrumental music expresses linguistically inexpressible thoughts and meanings largely arises from its possession of this peculiar combination of inarticulateness and articulateness that Herder identifies. For this combination can easily give rise to illusions that instrumental music expresses linguistically inexpressible thoughts and meanings in at least two ways. First, instrumental music often expresses a composer's linguistically expressible thoughts and meanings, but in ways that are vague, making it hard for a listener to pin down the thoughts and meanings in question with any precision from the music. This presence of definite linguistically expressible thoughts and meanings, which, however, the listener finds him or herself unable to pin down linguistically with any precision, easily gets misconstrued by him or her as a presence of definite thoughts and meanings that cannot be linguistically expressed. So that's one mechanism of illusion here. Second, music, and this is, one has to listen very closely because this is very carefully formulated. Second, music often expresses and communicates more precisely than could be achieved by language alone certain nuances of feeling and emotion. That is, certain psychological states that are other than thoughts and meanings, but which can easily be mistaken for them, especially given that they do involve them, these are the intentional objects, of course, and that other thoughts and meanings are expressed in the music as well. In sum, I suggest that when one considers the several possible closest specifications and sources of the intuition that instrumental music expresses linguistically inexpressible thoughts and meanings in this way, the intuition in the end proves to be illusory. As I implied earlier, analogous points would hold for painting as well, and no doubt for other non-linguistic arts. For painting too sometimes expresses vague, metaphysical or quasi-religious thoughts or religious thoughts. It too involves technical thoughts, in scare quotes, and ideas which are sometimes linguistically expressible by the artist and sometimes not, for example, concerning perspective or color. And it too tends to combine relative inarticulateness in the expression of thoughts and meanings with relative articulateness in the expression of nuances of feeling and emotion. The former part of that point is obvious, I take it, the relative inarticulateness in expressing thoughts and meanings compared to language. Concerning the latter half, this greater articulateness in expressing emotions or feelings, think, for example, of Rembrandt's self-portraits. Right? He produced many, as most of you know, many self-portraits over the duration of his life, and they're profoundly revealing of states of emotion associated with the respective ages, and in a way, with such nuance that I think it's fair to say that in many of the cases of the older portraits, for example, one doesn't really get the emotion until one reaches that age and has similar emotive resources available, because the nuance is so fine. Well, so much by way of a brief defense of Herder's refined narrow expressivism. As I mentioned, though, I think that there are also two important grains of truth in broad expressivism, one of which Herder perceives, but the other not. The former, the one he does perceive, is difficult to capture correctly, but let me try to articulate it in three parts as follows. First of all, as Herder himself implies, non-linguistic art often succeeds in expressing fine nuances of feeling or emotion that language alone cannot. Secondly, moreover, and this is a point that Herder certainly anticipates in his account of music, but which has since been elaborated by several other people, including Collingwood. In many cases, non-linguistic art not only expresses them, but also in part constitutes them. in the sense that they could not exist without such expression. And the example I like best for this, it's not a perfect example, but it's a rather impactful one, I think, is the case of tragedy. You know, we were talking about tragedy earlier. Of course, Aristotle set us all off on the wrong track about tragedy, the character of tragedy, when he told us that the spoken word, that the written word or the spoken word was the crucial thing, and that the opsis, the spectacle, including things like the dance and the music, not just the vision of the stage, was all sort of secondary. I mean, that's not what tragedy was about. You know, a lot of the communication of what it communicated happened through the combination, the interaction of all of these aspects together. One could give very dramatic examples of this if one had time. So anyway, when one takes that into account, you know, so tragedy is largely a non-linguistic art form. That's the point we need for these purposes. And the idea is, and it's an idea that's been worked out, at least implied by Jean-Pierre Vernant in France, in his work on ancient tragedy, that once you have tragedy as an artistic genre, it constitutes a certain kind of emotional resource, in particular, a sense of the tragic, right? So when we experience events in our lives as tragic in something more than just the kind of kitschy sense of that term, we're having an emotion that is essentially constituted by our awareness of that genre. Right? So this would be an example of the kind of constitutive role that I'm interested in. And thirdly, in consequence of these 2 points, as Herder again implies, the expressibility and even the very existence of certain thoughts and meanings, most obviously ones that refer to the feelings just mentioned, but also ones that depend on them in other ways, depend on non-linguistic art's expression of the relevant feelings. Whatever linguistic expressions of the thoughts and meanings in question may occur are dependent on non-linguistic art's expression of the relevant feelings. So there are going to be cases like this. That's the concession in the direction of broad expressivism. This dependence of the expressibility and even the very existence of certain feelings and hence of certain thoughts and meanings on the expressive power of the non-linguistic arts comes close to what broad expressivism had in mind. Nonetheless, I want to suggest that it falls short of actually entailing broad expressivism and remains consistent with narrow expressivism for 2 main reasons. First of all, focusing on the first 2 points I just made, the nuances of feeling which on this view can only be expressed and are moreover in part constituted by non-linguistic art are not themselves thoughts or meanings. They're only possible foundations for such. And secondly, focusing on the third point, it's consistent with this view that language should still be both necessary for and able to express the thoughts or meanings that these nuances of feeling support. It's just that language can only constitute and express them insofar as it's aided by relevant non-linguistic art in a certain way. In other words, it's a case where, as in many others, the functioning of language depends on extra-linguistic support of one kind or another. Probably all of our use of language does in the end. It may be a special case of that because expression is involved, but it's a special case, but it is a case of that. The other important grain of truth in broad expressivism is the one that Herder did not recognize, and recognizing it calls for a significant, though not, I think, huge revision of his position. It seems to me that refined narrow expressivism, as it was standardly conceived not only by Herder but also by his tradition, involved a certain mistaken assumption, and that it consequently needs to make a concession towards, in the direction of broad expressivism, but one that can, I suggest, should take the form of a modification of narrow expressivism, bringing it a little closer to broad expressivism, not an abandonment of it for the latter or an adoption in the middle between the two. So this is the sense in which it's a somewhat modest revision. What's the mistaken assumption in question here? Well, the refined narrow expressivist in this tradition generally thinks of language in the usual sense as restricted to a very limited range of material perceptible media, namely audible noises made with the mouth, speech, and visible but non-pictorial marks on paper, wax, stone, or some similar substance, writing. So speech or writing are the two possibilities that are entertained. Herder, in particular, normally thinks of language in such a restrictive way. In fact, ultimately, he'll reduce even further. He thinks that spoken language is really where everything, that on which everything rests in the end. But certainly he doesn't think there are forms of language beyond that, except in perhaps a metaphorical sense. So Herder normally thinks of language in such a restricted way, and so too do other narrow expressivists who are influenced by him, including Schleiermacher and Wilhelm von Humboldt. These are no small figures, by the way. But now how, a broad expressivist may well ask, could these two sorts of material perceptible media, among the many others that are conceivable and perhaps indeed even actual, possibly possess the sort of privilege as fundamental vehicles of thought and meaning that the refined narrow expressivist is attributing to them? Would this not be inexplicable, a sort of miracle, right, that those two very specific material perceptible forms were the only ones that could do it? Indeed, is it not, on reflection, clear that other material perceptible media at least could, and perhaps even do, serve as fundamental vehicles of thought and meaning as well? For example, the sort of highly conventional, and to use a very, very dangerous term, unrealistic pictures that are used to express ideas in some ancient Egyptian painting. Pictures that are distinct from, but closely related in form and function to, hieroglyphics. These are this is a case, a sort of genre that Gombrich identified and discusses at some length in Art and Illusion. Or beyond the sphere of art, sign language is used by the deaf. Or gestures. We saw a wonderful example of that with the Australian film today, right? People relying much more on gesture to communicate than we usually do. And perhaps even more exotic media, such as some animals may actually use, for instance, touch and chemical emissions. Right? I mean, at least these seems to be possible media, and indeed one can make a pretty strong case that in some cases they're actual media, actual vehicles of thought and meaning. I think the refined narrow expressivist like Herder simply has to concede this point. This is a point that one should simply roll over on if one is a refined narrow expressivist like Herder. Incidentally, the Saussure has this sort of broad conception of language already. That's what makes him an anticipator of semiotics, right? That he doesn't think of language as having that very narrow, that very restricted set of possibilities. Now, this might seem like a huge concession or large concession for Herder to make to broad expressivism if he makes such a concession as I'm recommending. However, I want to suggest that, on the contrary, it can and probably should be made in a way that allows him to hold that he's, in this way, only modestly revising his position rather than abandoning it for broad expressivism or taking a position midway between the two. And here are three reasons. First, and most importantly, it seems plausible to say that such alternative material perceptible media could only share with spoken and written language the function of serving as fundamental vehicles of thought and meaning to the extent that they took on the same sort of highly rule-governed, conventional character as spoken and written language have. And I'm not going to go into the very difficult and interesting question of what exactly the rule-governed and conventional character that spoken and written language is. But let's just take it that there is such a character, and the idea would be that they can only, these other media can only serve as such fundamental vehicles if they have that character. And thereby themselves become naturally describable as language in a sense of language that only barely, if at all, goes beyond the usual sense of the word. So this is the first point. You need to have this rule-governed conventional character that language in these two modalities has, in order to have function as this fundamental vehicle. And when you do, you're pretty much a language in the usual sense. The case of deaf sign language nicely illustrates this fact, both in the sense that such sign language displays the same highly rule-governed conventional character as spoken and written language has, or have, and in the sense that it shows how naturally and seamlessly we extend our usual concept of language to cover a materially, perceptually unusual case, provided only that that character is present. So that's the first point, perhaps the most important point. Second, this criterion excludes rather than includes many forms and aspects of non-linguistic art, and moreover, the very ones that we tend to think of as most responsible for making it art, namely those that are not guided by rules or conventions, but which instead involve a sort of spontaneity and novelty. In other words, not only will any so-called non-linguistic medium that can serve as a fundamental vehicle for thought and meaning to the same extent turn out in fact to be language in something very much like the usual sense of the word language, but in addition, it will to the same extent turn out not to be art in the usual sense of the word art. Thirdly, though perhaps less importantly, I put less weight on this factor, but I think it is still significant, while it does indeed seem clear that alternative material perceptible media such as those that I recently mentioned could serve as fundamental vehicles of thought and meaning independently of spoken and written language, it seems doubtful that they do so to any great extent in practice. So there's a kind of contingent fact here that's relevant at least. For example, the thoughts and meanings that the ancient Egyptian artist expressed through his conventional pictures were presumably in fact ones that he was already able to articulate in spoken and perhaps also written language. It depends whether he was a scribe or not. The heavy dependence of deaf sign language on pre-existing spoken and written language is obvious as well, albeit that the exact degree and nature of the dependence are controversial questions. Gesture, too, typically functions alongside equivalent spoken or written language rather than instead of it. For example, the index finger circling at the temple means he's crazy. And when one turns to animals' unusual material perceptible media, even if one grants that these do sometimes sustain thoughts and meanings autonomously of spoken and written language, as I suspect one should, the thoughts and meanings in question seem likely to be somewhat limited in character. Right? I mean, one's not going to have Shakespeare-like thoughts or Homer-like thoughts going on, presumably. Though this is all, very much sort of empirical and, as I say, not the core of the case. In sum, it seems to me that in the contest between the narrow and the broad forms of expressivism, refined narrow expressivism does in the end prove to be more or less the correct position, but that in order to be strictly correct, it needs to make two concessions towards broad expressivism. First, as Herder saw, that the expressiveness of language is in certain areas deeply dependent on that of the non-linguistic arts. And second, as he did not see, that spoken and written language is not the only possible fundamental vehicle for thought and meaning, but that other forms of language, including some that at least border on art, could, and perhaps even to some extent actually do, serve as such fundamental vehicles as well. If this is correct, then we may draw the following morals for the philosophy of language. It was one of the focuses I had in view. The philosophy of language can, in good conscience, continue to advance Herder's two principles, that thought is essentially dependent on and bounded by language, and that meaning consists in word usage, just as long as it keeps in mind that the language and words in question may require extra linguistic help, and that they need not be restricted to spoken and written language and words. There is, after all, no need to make room for non-linguistic, non-verbal fundamental vehicles of thought and meaning, as broad expressivism maintained. In addition, we may draw the following morals for the philosophy of art and the theory of interpretation, again very much in the spirit of Herder's considered position. Even non-linguistic artworks often express thoughts and meanings, but in doing so, they implicitly depend on language, so that their interpretation depends on the interpretation of language. It's never necessary to entertain the possibility that they express thoughts or meanings that transcend the artist's language. And indeed, it's not usually even necessary to entertain the possibility that they express ones that transcend his spoken and written language. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Unfortunately,
Sorry about that.
we don't have time for questions yet, but we have a short break. So if you have a question, please just come.
Yeah. Mob me in the hall.
Very brisk. Yeah.
Yep.
30 minutes only, yeah. So your talk will be the answer, a question, or... okay.
Oh,
we get
thanks,
some of your time? Okay.
Okay.
Then we have a little space. Who has a question first? Okay.
Thank you so much for a very stimulating and profound analysis of Herder and the whole question that his philosophy raises. I would like to play the devil's advocate a little bit, because I'm wondering concerning his reservations about the extra-linguistic dimension of meaning, and especially of music, whether he's not paying tribute to a very old tradition, in spite of all of his originality, which is very clear. But nonetheless, when you go back and you think as recently as Leibniz and the whole Pythagorean Platonic tradition, the idea of the universal harmony, which, as Leibniz himself says, comes out of the realm of music, but not human music, but rather the celestial harmony. And you think of all of the representations of Saint Cecile, where you have the heavenly instruments of the angels, and next to that you have all of these inferior instruments. Raphael's Saint Cecile in Bologna is a typical example, where you have the heavenly instruments and these broken violins underneath on the ground, to say that in fact or let's say that human ways through music of expressing meaning are so inferior and can never reach the level of what is really the metaphysical sense of and implication of music in general. And it's very strange that, you gave some very good examples of the way in which Herder does open the door to something else. Nonetheless, I think that the really important moment, and I was interested that you didn't mention one name in your talk, and that was the name of Schopenhauer. Because it seems to me that with Schopenhauer, there's a complete change in the way in which we think about the relation between music and language. I'm thinking of his chapter on the metaphysics of music. And precisely the idea that it's not through language and concepts, but through music that we reach this metaphysical singularity. And we know the tremendous influence it had on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. We'd go beyond that. And so I'm thinking that our whole way in our modern world since Schopenhauer of thinking about music and its extra-linguistic meanings is much less dependent on this older tradition, which I think Herder was still given the influence of Leibniz on his thinking, that perhaps he was still in thinking in the horizon of that. But that's just a...
Thanks. Yeah, I think there are two very interesting questions there, and one of them is this question of whether the idea about these seemingly anyway, non-linguistic arts expressing thoughts and sensations isn't really a part of an older and longer tradition. And that came across in Guido's talk nicely as well. I mean, he was quoting earlier sources from the early 18th century who were already talking in those terms about music expressing thoughts and sensations and so on. And I think Herder, would actually be, and I on his behalf would be quite happy about that there's a longer tradition here. I mean, what the new twist he's introducing, of course, is reconciling that with his philosophy of language, which is not something that's been commonly championed before. And that's really the trick. I mean, seeing you can have both of those things. So that on that question, I'd say that. On Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer is a wonderful example of what I was calling broad expressivism. And it's a different kind of broad expressivism from Hegel's. Hegel precisely doesn't think of music in this connection. He thinks of sculpture and architecture as the media that can support thoughts extra-linguistically. But Schopenhauer has his candidate too. I mean, it's music. And it's against that kind of view that I was trying to defend Herder's line, basically. Thanks.
I have a question, a very fundamental question concerning the whole setup of the comparison, that the same as Guido did, and the way it's always set up. I mean, what are we comparing really when we're comparing music and language? Is that really, are we comparing things that are on the same level? Because on the one hand, you have a means of articulation that is used to convey thoughts and meanings in an everyday pragmatic sense. And on the other hand, you have an art form. Or maybe there is a kind of music that is used in a pragmatic sense, that like an everyday music. And something that Angelika Böck said this morning seemed to point into that direction, like people in Australia, Aborigine people being identifiable by songs. So this would not be music as an art, but music as something else. And it would still be music. But if you're comparing music as an art form to language, the comparison seems to be lopsided somehow. I'm thinking of Suzanne Langer's contention that art is the creation of symbols of human feeling, which is taking things a bit too far, I think. But all art is. So that's music and dance and also poetry and literature. So what you would have to do maybe is compare art, including literature, to language as a means of communication. But that's a different comparison.
Yes.
So you'd be doing something different.
Well, I think you're picking up on one of the very important features of this line of argument, which is, and one could, I guess, make this a whole subject of a paper unto itself, that the picture of a sharp disjuncture between the two is misleading or wrong. So you could have things that look like art and turn out to be actually better classified as language. And that was the example with the Gombrich cases, right, in visual art. Or to think of an example from music, the ancient Greeks, I mentioned the dithyramb, which has this ritual set of meanings. But there are also cases where music was used in warfare, for example, to signal retreat or advance. And that's a case where something that looks like music, and perhaps, is reasonably classified as music, is actually metamorphosing and becoming language. So this is a crucial part of the argument, that don't be too sure that you know whether it's art or language, right? Because it can look rather similar and turn out to be one or the other. And it has very much to do whether there is this presence of the rule-governed conventional character that's typical of language or not. Whether there's that or it's more a matter of originality, spontaneity, inventiveness, or something like that. And so insofar as there is a sort of question about whether there's a border there, whether there should be a border there. A particular view on that is crucial to the argument. Namely, don't think there is a sharp border there, let alone that they're on different levels or whatnot. I mean, clearly they're on the same level in the sense that they are expressive media in some broad sense of expressive, right? I mean, there's no problem talking about them in the same breath as the same sort of thing, so long as one means expression in a broad enough sense.
Darf ich es auf Deutsch machen? Da geht es
Ja,
noch kürzer
ja.
und wir sind in Zeitdruck.
Ja.
Für mich war der fruchtbare Punkt in der Herrenentwicklung, als die Wahrnehmung ins Spiel kam mit dem Argument, ja Moment, Wahrnehmung hat begriffliche Strukturen. Ich kann nicht die Wahrnehmung gegen Begrifflichkeit ausspielen und das kann man mit Gombrich und Sellers und so weiter. Einheit, Vielheit, hier, da, okay, völlig richtig. Aber die Wahrnehmung hat natürlich noch eine andere Seite. Die Wahrnehmung hat nicht begriffliche Strukturen. Und die Wahrnehmung hat Differenzierungsmöglichkeiten. Du hast immer wieder von Nuancen gesprochen. Sehr schön. Diese Nuancen, das sind genuin Wahrnehmungsdifferenzierungen, die nicht begrifflicher Art sind. Die Wahrnehmung hat auch holistische Funktionen, die nicht begrifflicher Art sind, was die Gestalttheorie uns gezeigt hat. Geht auf Schemata, geht nicht auf Begriffe. Wenn man das im Auge hat, dann würde ich sagen, das Wunderbare ist in der Kunstwahrnehmung, also ob das jetzt instrumentelle Musik ist oder Bilder oder was, dass auch diese anderen Seiten der Wahrnehmung, die nicht begrifflichen Seiten der Wahrnehmung, natürlich im Spiel sind und zur Geltung kommen. Und dafür ist die Frage, ich sage es ein bisschen brutal, irrelevant oder falsch gestellt, ob Gedanken in nicht begrifflicher Form da übermittelt werden. Meinetwegen sind alle Gedanken begrifflich, das ist geschenkt. Das Interessante ist, was wird vermittelt, was nicht gedanklich ist in der Kunstwahrnehmung. Davon lebt die Kunst. And by the way, Roger Scruton has written another very good book. The title is I Drink, Therefore I Am.
Last question.
Okay, maybe I can take them in order. Thanks. That's a lovely question. What am I arguing here for? Though? I mean, the two questions I was raising were whether there's anything in the phenomenon of non-linguistic art that conflicts with his philosophy of language principles. And so long as you're saying, that there is conceptual structure in the perceptual presuppositions of non-linguistic art, there is thought going on, structuring it, and that's dependent on language. I don't care what you want to then go on to say about the non-conceptual, non-linguistic parts. I mean, I'm very happy to concede that there's a whole world of richness there that goes beyond that. That's sort of okay. And similarly, I think with the expressivism, varieties of expressivism point. I mean, the question there was, given that it seems really plausible that thoughts and meanings are essentially dependent on material, perceptible media, how are we to think of the media they're dependent upon? Must they be linguistic, or can they be other than linguistic, cut free from the linguistic, and transcend the linguistic? And there too, I think this extra richness is not going to undermine anything I was wanting to argue for it always indeed being linguistic. Yeah. But I completely agree with you about all of the other dimensions of perception. Yes, I mean, it's certainly not a project of reducing perception to the conceptual. It's not a rationalist project, as it were.
Thank you so much. As a composer, I have a particular viewpoint on some of these things, and I'm wondering how you are squaring these overlapping and intersecting and not necessarily parallel ideas of loosely, casually called language, such as composers have their own language that we are trying to develop, and using ideas of form and syntax or recurring motifs or different aspects of language, connecting phrases, recapitulation of the melody, etc., different ways that that sounds get diversed and come back to a more static area, and all these things are based on the memory, and even in one piece there can be a kind of quasi-language that gets developed about introducing the ideas that are going to be developed, and then developing these ideas in a quasi-linguistic kind of way, and climaxing them and bringing them down, recapitulating them, taking them through different movements and different variations. And it's definitely, this is the language of composition, and also with individual composers, the language of Wagner, the language of Beethoven, they have their specific idiosyncratic ways and that make them them, and make their ability to build these emotional states.
Yeah.
And in a sense, you know, to go off that, it seems that there's an association, it's maybe a language, but a mechanism of association that can conjure up moods, such as, to go very crass in the low way of the movies, that can conjure up fear of the particular intervals, the minor seconds of intervals that can conjure up sharks or fear, and these particular kinds of tricks that Hollywood or cinema does to create a commonality of what is considered fear amongst certain communities, or the minor scale, for example, is considered sad in certain cultures, and the major one is uplifting. And when you want things to come together, how to use particular thirds and perfect fifths, and how to use these kind of Pythagorean intervals, which are really based on really mathematical realities in the brain that conjure up certain kinds of moods. So I think it's actually very certain of these questions are really based on also how the brain is responding to these things. But in terms of all these intersections of casually used notions of syntax, and how that squares with this idea of making these comparisons in some ways of apples and oranges.
Yeah, I mean, I completely buy all of this description of the phenomenology of composing. I have no problems with any of this, and but as I was trying to suggest, there are two different sorts of cases that one needs to distinguish here. One is the case where the musician or the composer has that kind of conceptualization available for what they're doing. Linguistic conceptualization, just as you were using it yourself now. And the other is the case where they don't, right? Where they are doing what you will want to describe as this sort of syntactically consistent development or whatnot, but they themselves don't use this terminology, right? Because they haven't had your musical training or whatnot. And the suggestion was that in the former case, it is going to make sense to talk about this as musical thinking in a perfectly usual sense of the term, but then that's because it's based in this linguistic foundation that you have. It's not an exception to the rule that you need language for thought. But in the other option, which is at least as important an option, is the one where you don't have that linguistic set of tools, and you nonetheless have perhaps equally sophisticated musical composition going on, invention going on. And my suggestion was, in that case, it's not quite right to call this thinking and meaning and so on, and one has a very plausible competitor description available in terms of creation and perception of complex sound patterns and relationships. So that was the sort of the two-track move that I was making there. And then where development's concerned, I think this was part of your question as well, and this is a very interesting part of it for me. So sort of the unexpected. I mean, bringing something noch nie da gewesen ist into existence, something that's never there before, this sort of inventive part. Now, I take it that that's going to be an important part of the story of what happens in either case, right? And even way beyond art and music, in language itself. You know, there's conceptual invention, right? There's developing new concepts. Culture does this all the time. Individuals, imaginative individuals like Plato and so on, do this all the time. So invention, the dynamic, creating something new aspect is going to be important. I take it across the board. But I don't think that's going to change the these options, right? I mean, it's going to be either a linguistically based creation, in which case you can talk of it as a creation in thought, meaning, in a perfectly everyday sense, or it's going to be a creation of the other sort, the non-linguistically based sort, in which case it's a creation of new complex sound relationships, perception of new ones perhaps, and so on. It's not going to affect, I think, the issues I'm dealing with here, but it's an extremely interesting issue in its own right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. Thanks.